Doctrine of Severability. Part 3 of the Indian Constitution talks about fundamental rights. With the adoption of the Indian Constitution in 1950, the fundamental rights also came into effect. Fundamental rights are the inherent rights available to all the citizens of India. These rights guarantee every citizen of India to be able to lead a life of dignified existence and holistic all-round development. The courts can strike down any law which infringes upon the fundamental rights guaranteed by the Indian Constitution. But sometimes it may happen that only some portion of the law is in violation of the fundamental rights. What is to be done in such a case? It is here that the doctrine of severability is invoked. Article 13 made void all such laws in force in India before the commencement of the Constitution which were inconsistent with the provisions of the fundamental rights. The doctrine of severability is derived from the very same Article 13. Deriving power from the Article 13, the doctrine of severability states that if any particular provision of the impunged law is violative of the fundamental rights and the rest of the law isn't, only that particular provision of the law would stand void and not the entire statute. Hence, the doctrine of severability, in a way, lays down that non-violative provision is separated from the violative provision such that the non-violative provision can exist without the violative provision. In such a case, the non-violative provision will be upheld as valid and enforceable. Doctrine of severability, important cases. In the Nordenfeldt versus Maxim Nordenfeldt Guns and Ammunition Company Limited 1876 case, we see one of the first uses of the doctrine of severability. In this case, one portion of the contract was violative, hence the court struck down the violative part of the contract and upheld the rest of the contract. Rmdc versus the State of Bombay. In the context of India, the doctrine of severability was discussed in detail in the Rmdc versus the State of Bombay. What is the way to find out whether the valid and invalid parts of a statute can be separated? In order to know this, the intent of the legislature is the deciding factor. In order to find out whether the valid part of the statute can be separated from the invalid part, the intention of the legislature is the determining factor. What if the valid and the invalid parts are inseparable for the statute's existence? In such a case, the entire statute would become invalid. In a case where while the valid and the invalid case are separable, but the intent of the legislature was to keep it as a part of the same scheme, the whole statute would stand invalid. In a case where the valid and invalid parts are separable and also are not a part of the same intent and scheme, but making any of the parts invalid would leave the rest too weak to be valid, the whole statute would be invalidated. Hence, the doctrine of severability takes into consideration the construed meaning as a whole of the statute instead of any part or provision. The process to know the intent of the legislature behind the statute would go through knowing the history, object, preamble, etc. A.K. Gopalan versus State of Madras. In the A.K. Gopalan versus State of Madras, the court dealt with the Preventive Detention Act. In this, the court held that Section 14 of the Preventive Detention was violative of the Article 14 of the Indian Constitution. While doing so, the court added that while we strike only Section 14, the objective of the Act wasn't changed. A similar observation was made in D.S. Nakara versus Union of India. F.N. Bulsara versus State of Bombay. The court in the F.N. Bulsara versus State of Bombay held that while the violative provisions of the Bombay Prohibition Act 1949 was struck down, the validity of the entire Act is not jeopardized. Similarly, the Apex Court also declared the Section 4 and 55 of the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act to be violative and hence struck it down. While doing so, the remaining Act remained intact and valid. Quixote Holohan versus Zachilu. In Quixote Holohan versus Zachilu case, the Supreme Court held that the 10th schedule remained while it struck down the paragraph 7 to be violative of the Article 368(2), which states that an amendment to this constitution may be initiated only by the introduction of a bill for the purpose in either the House of Parliament and when the bill is passed in each house by a majority of total membership of that house present and voting. It shall be presented to the President, who shall give his assent to the bill, and thereupon the Constitution shall stand amended in accordance with the terms of the bill. To conclude, with the help of doctrine of severability, the application of judicial review opens up. While the power of judicial review, the courts in India can invalidate any law which infringes the fundamental rights of the individuals of the country. While filing a petition and contending that any particular legislation is taking away their fundamental rights, it is upon him or her to provide proof as to how the impunged legislation is interfering with their rights. The doctrine of severability thus helps keep legislatures accountable to the fundamentals of the Constitution, fundamental rights being one of them. Thank you. If you haven't subscribed to Thought Chakra, click on the subscribe button as well as the bell icon so that you can keep getting updates about the videos that we're uploading related to polity, history, and other subjects.